Please welcome Consultant to the Durst Organization, Partner Emeritus, Cook Fox Architects, Partner Terrapin Bright Green. Please welcome Bob Fox.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. It is a pleasure to see a pretty full room for this amazing speaker. I have a distinct privilege of introducing a person who I've just met 30 minutes ago, and I feel like I've known him for 30 years. You'll find out. He has logged more than 5,000 miles on his skis in pursuit of documenting our planet's climate crisis. Sebastian Copeland is an award-winning photographer, explorer, author, and environmental advocate whose de facto profession as witness has brought him to the front lines of climate change, observing otherwise remote events, reporting them, and drawing the connection between what's happening out there to the consequences that appear in our daily lives. The message conveyed through his stunning art is urgent and clear. Climate change is real and relevant, and we need global action to meet the challenges that lie ahead. Sebastian has led expeditions across the Arctic Sea, Greenland, and Antarctica, earning multiple records in the process. Among them is the first east-west transcontinental crossing of Antarctica, a 2,500-mile journey completed in 82 days. Got to think about that a little bit. In August, he wrapped up the first leg of his most recent adventure called The Last Great March, a two-part unassisted journey on foot through the Simpson Desert in Australia, and he plans a trek by land to the North Pole from Canada, which is slated for February of this year. He has written 3 books, including Arctica, The Vanishing North, which is based on a decade of traveling this remote northern territory, which won the 2016 ITB Berlin Book Award. He has also directed 2 films, including Across the Ice, which was just released. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sebastian Copeland to the stage.
Thank you very much, and thank you, USBG, for having me here. It's a great pleasure and a great honor, and it's nice to see so many people showing up for such an important event in the history of our development, this transition to sustainability. So I've just come back from crossing the Simpson Desert, as Bob was saying. And it's basically a trip that entailed pulling a full cart of water, starting with 400 pounds, or 35 liters, for 26 days over a little over 400 miles, and what turned out to be 1,000 dunes, varying in elevations between 30 and 100 feet. Basically, it's a donkey's job. The Simpson is one of the driest environments in the world, and the driest desert in Australia. And not surprisingly, the expedition's greatest challenge, other than the effort, was the limited water that we could carry, my partner and I. The heat made dehydration a real threat. The rations, that is, or the ratio of drinking, was 35 sips of water per day, with exertion that lasted up to 11 hours. Each sip of water took a profound significance, and the longing for more water became almost obsessional. All day my mouth felt so dry that I felt I had swallowed an ashtray. And every day I had to suppress the urge to want to steal some of my partner's water, and him the same. desperate people do desperate things. And I felt then a profound sense of kinship and a connection with the more than 1 billion people across the world who struggle every day with that proper access to water. And I vowed to cherish and savor every single glass of water when I'd come home. Those glasses that I'd fantasize about. You have no idea the significance that a sip of water means when you're so thirsty. And when I got home, I turned on the faucet, I poured myself a glass. And you know what happened? Basically, it was just a glass of water. No more, no less. Not super exciting. And therein lies the conundrum, the real challenge, the essence of that disconnect that we have with what is surely one of the greatest threats from climate change. The Syrian conflict dominates the news with horrendous stories of human tragedies, which has resulted in over 1.5 million refugees since 2015. But there are more than 60 million refugees worldwide, or internally displaced people right now. That is one person for every 122 people on this planet who are either a refugee or internally displaced. And that trend is rising. It's already defining the 21st century in what I think is the greatest crisis of the 21st century. And 50+% of those people come from areas where food stress combined with civil unrest has made life intolerable and forced humans to further risk their lives in the hope of a better future for them and their families. Climate change affects many systems, but the one we should be most concerned about is food and water scarcity. On the surface, conflicts may seem like the main driver, but people are half as likely to pick up a weapon and go to war if they have enough food on their table to feed their families. Climate change is a social destabilizer and a geopolitical threat. If you consider this, in 2010, you'll remember that Russia had unprecedented drought, which broke into thousands of fires, up to 5,500 fires burned at the same time. You could see them from space. And it affects Russia's grain production. Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine account for 1/4 of wheat exports worldwide. By the summer of 2010, these fires broke out across the country from Moscow to Siberia. The price of wheat jumped up 66% because acres of hay and wild grass were burnt. Farmers switched to barley to feed their cows, and the price of meat and milk and related products went up accordingly. Putin put a freeze on grain exports, essentially from 94 million tons of grain. The yield dropped by 1/3. Now, Egypt is the world's largest grain importer, greatest wheat importer. In fact, most of the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa accounts for some of the largest grain importers of the world. So it's not surprising that 6 months later, in February of 2011, in response to soaring food prices, a man set himself in a food market in Tunisia, setting the spark for what was to become the Arab Spring. Soon in Egypt, Libya, Bahrain, Yemen, etc., all these countries would follow. Studies show that the likelihood of conflicts in tropical regions or subtropical regions doubles on El Nino years, which are hot and dry, versus the El Niñas, which are cooler. Climate change affects global calories and calorie production. and it affects peace. Currently, there's more than 1 billion people who lack adequate water supplies, and 2 billion who are malnourished. With each degree of rise, we lose 10% of the world's calories and 7% of its hydrology. And that's just the human population, because of course it affects all of biology, animals, insects, plants. It's an insidious and self-perpetuating cycle. All species are affected. And we are presently 1 degree warmer than we were in 1880. So with that statistic, that represents 10% less global calories and 7% less of its water. The world's temperature records have become all too common. Every year seems to bring another record. In fact, September of 2016, last month, marked the 378th consecutive month in which global temperatures exceeded 20th century average. And the summer of 2016, the summer was so far the warmest ever recorded, which will almost certainly make 2016 the warmest year on record, making it 9 out of the last 10 consecutive years the warmest on record. 6 years of unprecedented drought preceded the Syrian conflict from 2005 to 2010, and by the way, it is an ongoing drought. Again, people are a lot less likely to pick up weapons and go to war. In 2011, of course, the civil unrest started and growing into the massive war that it is today. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 followed several years of steep decline in agricultural yield. Studies show now that the Hutus killed the Tutsis not just out of ethnic hatred, but also as a land grab to steal their land for farming. In Sudan, it was the drought that pushed the Arabs into the lands of African ethnic cattle farmers. In 2003, the government supported the Arabs murdering the Zagawas, the Furs, and the Masali tribes, using food stresses as a political strategy. In fact, China, the United Emirates, northern South Korea, that is, were already willing to pay big money for northern Sudan's fertile lands, joining Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Japan, who have all bought or leased lands in Africa. Why? Because aquifers are being depleted from California to Saudi Arabia and Iran. And no water means no food. And no food means conflict. For environmental scientists, the strength and frequency of these drought events go far beyond natural variabilities. They all point to human-induced climate change. The refugee crisis is equally weakening Europe at the moment, galvanizing populists and xenophobes who call for strict enforcement of national borders and threaten the Union. Russia has already intervened in Ukraine and Crimea for its own control of the grain production and strategic positioning. Russia's policies are aimed at weakening Europe and strengthening its positions. Given the growing food and water scarcity around the world, we've only seen the tip of the proverbial iceberg. And the refugee crisis is a geopolitical threat that we will not solve it as long as we do not address climate change. By now, you're probably wondering, why is he talking about desert if he's supposed to be an ice specialist, right? And what is the connection with the polar regions? Well, some of you actually might even wonder if I've actually set foot on the ice. And in order to squash that thought in your mind, I'll share this image with you. Yeah, it's a little intimate. That's the bathroom, on Antarctica at least. And it should help answer that one question that always comes up. Where do you go when you spend 3 months on the ice? Well, now you know. You're looking at it, seriously. I have spent years traveling the polar regions. I've reached the North and South Pole on foot. I've put more than 8,000 kilometers under my skis in the polar regions. And during that travel, I was privileged to witness some of the best the planet has to offer. Amazing sculptural shapes, sparse, untouched, and unpopulated lands. Months of not seeing another human being, which is wonderful. And studying the ice. I saw places in Greenland where the sky and the ice met like a Rothko painting. I saw ethereal shapes on Antarctica that had never seen a human footprint before. I was privileged to travel these places, and I also learned that ice is a good indicator of where the world is headed. In fact, there is a saying in my field that if you want to know where the world is going, you need look no further than the poles. It is a canary in the coal mine, a predictor, if you will. And the poles are in trouble. And that spells trouble for all of us. The Arctic sea ice cover, the Arctic Sea, of course, is an ocean that is covered by ice, has lost 53% of its cover in 30 years, with 2016 being the second smallest index after 2012. The others are 2008, 2007, 2011, 2015, 2012. You get the idea. This is a grouping. We're losing the ice at the North Pole. In fact, the 10 lowest extent have all happened within the last 10 years, since satellite observations began in 1979. By now, many of you are familiar with this principle, the Albedo Effect, the reflection of sunlight off a light-colored surface. Essentially the same principle as walking on a hot day in the summer wearing a white t-shirt versus a black one. We all know the difference. The absorption of sun energy into the oceans where the ice is melting warms the top layer of the ocean and moves its way down the column, warming up to 700 meters below the surface. It's the same on organic matters on land masses. When the ice cover disappears and it turns it into infrared radiations that warm up the land and perpetuate the melting of the permafrost while heating up the atmosphere. The poles are warming at twice the rate of the rest of the planet. And in some areas, notably in regions of Alaska, that number is up to 5 and sometimes even 7 times the global average. Not surprisingly, that warming is affecting the sea ice, melting it faster. Not just in the index, which is how we're easily measuring the relationship of temperatures to ice, but also in its thickness, the density of it. Obviously, the thicker the ice, the more likely it is to sustain a summer melt. The thinner it is, the least likely it is to do so. And so it is that scientists are expecting it to disappear entirely within the summer months, any time between next summer and 2040, which would be 30 years ahead of IPCC predictions. And it hadn't happened in 125,000 years. The ice now is about 4 to 6 feet in depth on average, as opposed to 12 feet, which is what it was in the 1980s, and it's also what Admiral Perry had reported in 1909. So with an Arctic sea ice, or an Arctic free of sea ice, that is, we are essentially toying with the last major interglacial period, which was the Eocene, when sea levels were also 13 to 20 feet higher than they are today. Moving down to the other end of the world, the Antarctic Peninsula, that is one of the areas that warms up the fastest on the planet, up to 5 times the global average. It's warmed up essentially 1 degree per decade for the last 50 years. And the changes that are being witnessed there had not happened at that speed in at least 65 million years. That is the age of the last dinosaurs. And without dramatic action to reduce carbon emission, we're on pace to see a 5 to 6 degrees C rise in temperature by the end of the century. After years of scientific campaigning, public opinion is shifting. Politicians have taken notice. And luckily, most of the 195 members of the UN's Convention on Climate Change have committed to taking action on reducing emissions. But the sum of these actions will not likely keep emissions to that 2 degrees C limit. Besides, 2 degrees is an arbitrary number. The world does not know round decimals. And as well as that, it doesn't just stop when we set targets. Why? Because we're vastly underestimating the scope of the issue. And mostly because we don't factor feedbacks. Here's why. There are 2 alarming feedbacks mechanisms in the Arctic that are most alarming. Methane is a gas that is 84 times more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2 for the first 20 years of its emission. 5.3 million years ago, much of the northern Arctic was densely covered in spruce and pine forest. Global sea levels were also about 20 meters higher, or about 60 feet. Over the following 3 million years, that is, as the global climate cooled and the Antarctic Ocean gateway progressively closed, this is the area between the Bering Sea and the Greenland corridor. It's locked in its sea ice, and the region became thermally isolated. The cooling temperatures forced a migration of flora and fauna further south, and in that process, vast swaths of land absorbed huge quantities of carbon from decomposing organic matter, the dead forest, the plants, etc., now locked into what has become permafrost. Ocean levels rose and regressed during that period with the temperatures, as much as 120 meters, or more than 300 feet. The ocean floor was home to aquatic or land-based species, depending on the period. But all have decomposed and been preserved in methane form, whether submerged or on land in rich organic soil called peat, trapped in the permafrost. Recent studies point to an increase in methane release from both the thawing of permafrost and the ocean floor associated with rising temperatures. You see those bubbles here? These are from Siberia. And this is what happened if you crack the ice and light a match over it. There's presently 5 gigaton of methane in the atmosphere. Off the Siberian Arctic shelf alone, stored in about 70 meters of depth, are an estimated 1,000 to 5,000 gigatons of trapped methane. Now, I want that to sink in just for a moment. There is a 5 gigaton in the atmosphere presently, and just in that Siberia region, called Yodoma, are between 1,000 and 5,000 gigatons of methane. And those reserves of methane could undergo runaway decomposition composition, that is, once it starts to melt. Why? Because there is, when elevated temperatures hit those reserves of carbon, a microbe in the soil start to decompose, causing heat, which is a self-amplifying process, essentially a feedback onto itself. And the thawing of part of the permafrost has not yet been accounted by the IPCC in its prediction of that 2 degrees centigrade sea limit by the end of the century. It's likely that high levels of methane released 252 million years ago were responsible for the Great Permian Extinction Event, which was the largest extinction event, the third event and the largest that this planet has undergone. Only 4% of creatures survived that third Permian extinction event. All of us today, every single 30 million species on this planet, are survivors of the Great Permian Extinction Event. And scientists believe that it was methane in the atmosphere which killed 96% of all living species. As long as the ground stays frozen, all of the carbon remains stored. But thawing is threatening to turn the Arctic from a carbon sink into a carbon source. And it would threaten all life as we know it on the planet. Remember, 1 degree of temperature rise is 10% of global calories and 7% of its water. Now let's go back again to Antarctica, the other end of the world, and examine another feedback. The Pines and Thwaites glaciers in Antarctica and West Antarctica, both given to the Amundsen Sea. These are enormous glaciers. The Pines is almost 50 kilometers wide and 250 kilometers long and 2 kilometers thick. And these ice shelves float on the surface of the ocean. They're not grounded into the ground. The Pines alone accounts for 25% of Antarctica's ice loss. And these 2 glaciers alone are both losing 6 meters of thickness per year. That's 18 feet of thickness lost every year on the Pines and the Thwaites. Last year, NASA revealed a 10-year study that sent shivers through the community. Warming of the Antarctica coastal region, especially the western part, is melting the ice that pours into the ocean, making a colder surface. Meanwhile, warming climate has driven below the denser, cold surface water a warm current. We call it stratification. NASA realized that the ice shelf of the Pines and Thwaites were melting from below the surface and called that event unstoppable because of the sloping of the ground below the grounding line. So that grounding line is that region where the ice, the ground, and the ocean meet. And the sloping that goes into the continent goes on like this for hundreds of kilometers, which is the reason NASA called the event unstoppable. Now, I'm sure most of you are aware that scientists don't use words like unstoppable very easily, and for good reasons, because if it does become stoppable, then they've got that on their resume. This thing has a mind of its own, but it's coming back and forth. Here we go. Computer models and the UN's IPCC have predicted up to 4 feet of ocean rise by the end of the century. But they did not factor NASA's study on the Pines and Thwaites. And in fact, there will certainly be feedback just from those. Well, here we are. The Pines and Thwaites alone are estimated to rise ocean levels by 1.2 meters. Just those 2 glaciers alone. not factored in the 4 feet. 1.2 meters is essentially 4 feet. So this would be an additional 4 feet on top of the IPCC's prediction, and this would happen within the next 1 to 2 centuries. What is troubling is that these are becoming incidents that are being studied around Antarctica and Greenland. And in fact, another instance of the same phenomena has been discovered in East Antarctica this time. Now, 30 meters of coastal land is lost to each meter of rise. That's 100 foot essentially lost for 3 feet of rise. And areas like in Vietnam, essentially the second largest rice exporter in the world, the Mekong Delta lies just about 5 feet below ocean level. It is more than vulnerable to saltification and flooding, and its impact would have a direct correlation to global calories. There are more than 3.2 billion people who live in coastal areas. The Mekong Delta is called the food basket of Vietnam, and it provides almost half of the food for 95 million of its people. The region is, again, the second largest rice exporter in the world, and rice is the main food source for 50% of the world. Bangladesh, China, Vietnam, Indonesia, India, and of course not to mention the US, New York, New Jersey, Florida, New Orleans. All these areas are susceptible to flooding from climate change, which will generate millions of climate refugees, and this includes right here at home. Meanwhile, the drought. Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Afghanistan, South Sudan, Mali, China. The flow of refugees is a story of climate change. These are not skittles. These are people. These are you and me, our neighbors. There will be more than 250 million people displaced and becoming climate refugees within this century. Now, if we factor that 1.5 million have created the controversy that it has in just the last couple of years, think of what 250 million people would do, and that number will only increase. We're talking about a scaled redistribution of human demographics. For many of us, we've inherited our geographic location. We were born here. We didn't earn it. And plants and animals migrate when the conditions require it. Well, so do humans. For socioeconomic and environmental reasons, they will move by invitation or by force, because desperate people do desperate things. There are plenty of solutions to climate change. It is an exciting time. We have new technologies. This expo is all about that. All the new renewable solutions. But first, we need to adjust our attitudes. Climate change is not just a destructive force for human health. It lives in us as a destructive force of our human brotherhood. We need to look no further than this electoral cycle, or what's going on in Britain, what's going on in France, in Germany, in Holland. Left unchecked, climate change will not only destroy the planet, but it'll destroy our humanity. Now, we know generally that the 5 steps to combat climate change are essentially listed right here. Renewable energy, it's good. 90% of new energy created in 2015. In the US, 90% of new energy was renewable. That's great. Carbon tax, emissions control and offset, adaptation, reduction, reforestation for carbon sinks. But the one strategy that we must all contribute to is what I believe is the sixth item that's missing from that list, and that is compassion. Aside from independence from elite energy sources, oil, coal, tar sand, gas, shale gas, uranium, it's important to reframe the discussion and the perception of regulatory measures to include compassion for our fellow man and remove the fear from our hearts. We have to recognize that change is necessary, but it's not all bad. We have to repurpose our capital to speed up a transition towards a sustainable future, but also to embrace a mental transition to accepting our collective responsibilities. It is necessary, it is coming, and the only thing that stands between it and the future with widespread despair-induced conflict is ourselves. These are troubled but exciting times, full of disruptors, from Elon Musk to Pope Francis. The new economic vision will usher the third industrial revolution, and we're living through it right now. It's very exciting. We know that we need to be off carbon by mid-century, and we've got all the renewable energies to get us there. But the solutions lie really right there between our conscience, our greed, and our imagination. And none of those three need to be compromised. The only culprit is lack of compassion and complacence. You know, Churchill used to say that Americans always do the right thing, but that it usually takes exhausting every other option before getting there. This is an all-hands-on-deck moment in the history of our development. So let's make sure we don't get there too late. We have 30 years to make it happen. Thank you very much. Oh, there we are. I think we were doing some Q&A. Is Bob here? You're coming. All right. That's the voice of God.
I was too busy applauding. So.
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Let's thank Sebastian again. Great. I'm told there are 2 microphones out there, so if we have any questions, I'm sure Sebastian will be glad to answer them. And it's very hard to see, so.
Hi. I just have a quick question.
Please identify yourself first.
Oh, my name is Lindsay Caffrey. I'm a consultant for energy efficiency from New York City. I'm kind of just curious your opinion on some of the peat emissions that are coming out of places like Indonesia, where they're converting old rainforests into calorie-producing regions. So kind of your take on that swap as we try to grow more food, but are also releasing more carbon.
Was the last part of your question? I'm sorry?
As we're growing more food, we're also releasing more carbon. So how do you handle that kind of shift in that economy?
Well, that's a very good question because, of course, we have in that region, in Indonesia, a real issue with calorie production. And I think the answer to the question lies in technology. It's essentially developing technologies now. You know, the agro field is not my area of specialty, but I do know that a lot of work is being done on it, and especially with fertilizers, natural organic fertilizers that produce a greater yield without delivering as much of a carbon footprint. So, you know, I believe that the solution lies in technological advancements, and again, you know, I wish I knew more about the subject over there, but I'm mostly about the ice.
Please.
Hi, my name is Michelle Zimney. I do green building consulting here in California, and we need water. I was struck by, if I recall correctly, your statement that the polar regions are warming at 2 to 3, 5, even 7 times faster than the rest of the planet, and I have no idea why. Can you say more?
Well, that's thank you. That's a good question. You know, the regions that are being affected most by warming trends tend to be surrounded by oceans. And so ocean is what stores heat in the most stable and consistent manner. The change in temperature in the oceans is not as susceptible as changes in the weather. So even if there may be trends, seasonal, month-long trends that would be warming up much of the world, the ocean still stores that temperature through the various columns, you know, all the way down to 1,000 meters deep. So with the Arctic in itself, the Arctic is essentially, you know, both regions are essentially like the air conditioners of the world because they store so much of that ice. But the Arctic in particular is just essentially just a thin layer of ice. And so while it is very cold over there, the shift in temperature has more room to play, if you will. If our sort of global average temperature is around 57 degrees, that is, for the Arctic region, if that ice is susceptible to warming because of ocean currents and because of the incidence of warmer air currents coming from the jet stream as well, it can have a dramatic incidence on local temperatures. And so areas of Alaska are warming up at the fastest rate on the globe right now. Those are up to 7 times the global average. But the Antarctic Peninsula, which is essentially susceptible to currents that are coming both from jet stream and the ocean, is in fact being affected by those trends, and so it is offsetting the impacts of the cooling ice on those specific local regions.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Alec Giffen. Thank you for your message and your call to action. I think it's extraordinarily important and agree with you. I guess the question that I have is, isn't the issue of how we manage our forests and use our forests more complicated than simply reforestation? For example, we know that substituting wood for other construction materials like concrete, steel, aluminum in particular, that using wood greatly reduces carbon emissions. And I'd welcome your comment on that.
Well, I mean, I think the, you know, creating man-made forests to address construction needs, and Bob would be well suited to talk to this because he is a great architect. But it's not necessarily what we're looking at in terms of creating more of a carbon sink. It's protecting the dissemination of tropical rainforests around the world for purposes of agricultural applications. So the use of the wood in these regions is, of course, one of the reasons, but primarily the issue in these rainforests, and particularly in the Amazon, is for the use of transferring that use to agricultural purposes. And so, you know, your question relative to concrete and steel producing a greater source of carbon emission, you know, I would need to be familiar with those statistics, but what I do know is that the destruction of vast swaths of tropical rainforest, essentially annihilating the potential for a carbon sink, is an issue that we need to correct. And in fact, we need to create more carbon sink on the planet that way. Go ahead, Alec. I think you have something else to say.
Yeah. So clearly we need to stop the destruction of tropical rainforests. Given. Absolutely have to do it. But there are other places where we can produce wood, for example, in the temperate zones.
Sure.
Which seem to be well suited, very resilient and all. And in terms of statistics, if I remember the numbers correctly, it takes 10 times as much energy to produce a steel stud as it does a wooden stud. And therein, I think, lies the opportunity to try and increase wood production, doing it sustainably, and reducing carbon emissions by substituting wood for other materials.
I'd like to invite Bob to comment on that.
No, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it is a good direction to go. My concern is that, and what I was going to say, and this woman has a question, so I'm going to come to you, but I think everyone in this room agrees with you, right? We have a serious problem, and I got to think that almost everybody in this room is working on it, in some degree, some way. That's why they're here, and it's incredibly important that they're here. Do you feel that what happened in Paris recently, and the leaders of our planet, do you feel that they get it? Do you feel that there's enough of an imperative so that we can all start making a difference? These guys are all making a difference. There's no question, right? There's nobody here saying, well, he's wrong, and you know, we're all doing it, but we need them. Do you feel that we're finally at a tipping point here, that we're going to get some international action?
I think that we're in a race in slow motion. So it's incredibly frustrating because we're seeing decision makers, stakeholders, policymakers addressing the issue. And I think that if we were to be graded on a curve over the course of the next 50 years, I'd say we're doing pretty well. The problem, of course, is that we don't have those 50 years and that we're fighting special interests and private interests. I think that most politicians who showed up in Paris, I think that they all get it. I think it's the greatest emitters, you know, China and the US, India. These countries all suffer from the impacts of climate change, and there is a global consensus of its people demanding climate action. The real challenge is what happens in the back rooms of, you know, lobby-driven discussions on the Hill for us, or even in Sacramento here, and in the halls of power in these different countries. And so the only convincing argument to what you're asking is when renewable solutions become profitable, and that is what's happening right now. It's becoming cheaper to produce renewable energy than it is to produce carbon energy. So that's the argument. I wish it were a loftier one, but at least it's working. It's taking us a long time to get there, but we have to thank people in this room and in this hall and in the planet working on these issues for the human ingenuity that has led us to this place where we can actually address these problems with technological solutions that make economic sense. And combining those three forces, addressing, you know, public opinion, addressing the economic logic, and making political decisions is a perfect storm. And trying to massage that into implementing policies is the exciting times that we're presently living. It is certainly, and I've been in climate advocacy for the last 18 years, and the last time that I felt this excited was in 2007, when the global consciousness essentially started to tip and people started to talk about it, and the news media started to print more and more articles. I mean, you remember there's a time when seeing an article on climate change in the newspaper was an event. now it's essentially a daily occurrence. That's a good thing.
Please.
Hi, my name is Marley Kanda. I'm an architect in Boston. And I completely agree with everything you're saying, and I think that the goal, yes, by 2050 is to reach all of these milestones that you've discussed today. But maybe I'm a pessimist, but what if these things don't happen? Is someone looking at harvesting the methane that's in all of these Arctic glaciers? Is someone looking at, if the sea level rises, there are billions of people that don't have water. Is there a way to convert all of this melted, yes, salt water, into potable water, drinking water for all of the people in the country, or all the people in the world that don't have water?
I think that the short answer to that question is no. We are exceeding our carrying capacity on the planet. This is a finite environment, and there is a huge issue of human demographics that is the elephant in the room when we talk about climate change. So the answer to the question is that things will get worse before they get better. I'm not a dystopian. I was saying that earlier, and sometimes I feel like the discussion turns that direction. But at the end of the day, we're a species on this planet following a certain course, and whilst responsible for the latest course of action affecting all living things on this planet, we're also learning from those mistakes, and have to be graded on a curve. And so, at 7.4 billion presently and headed to 11 billion by mid-century, there's a time at which the clock is going to stop ticking for reproduction at the rate that we've been doing it. And this is, of course, another discussion that entails education and social programs and needs to be financed and whatnot. But will everyone do well in the process? Of course, they will not.
Thank you.
Please.
Jay Antle, Johnson County Community College. I'm a bit out of place here. I'm a historian among all of you technicians. And so I appreciated your discussion about compassion and understanding humans as humans, because I come from a humanities background. So my sense of it is that if we can get that common humanity part right, then everyone in this room will be empowered to figure out how we get there technically. So my question to you is, as a storyteller, how do you see your role as a storyteller, and what stories do you tell to get us to think more seriously about that common humanity, about that compassion, so we can get past Skittles, as you pointed out earlier?
Well, thank you. I hope that some of what I was talking earlier was some of that storytelling. But my role, as I see it anyhow, is to help people fall in love with their world, to grow that sense of attachment to it, because we don't save what we don't love. And that human connectivity to one another and to all living things is very much part of the equation. Because if we think purely in practical terms, whether they be economically based or technologically based, we're missing the thread that makes us human, that is our conscience. And so, without pointing the finger to the obvious culprits as we see it, the Koch brothers and the oil industry and all of that, even those can be swayed by the beauty around us and by the aspirational stories of becoming the best that we can be. And it's a simple proposition, but guess what? It's been around with us since the Greeks. The story of human tragedy in literature has been one of overcoming as well as succumbing. My role as a storyteller is to focus on the former.
Well, thank you very much for telling us your story, and I look forward to hearing more. I look forward to seeing your film, and I look forward to hearing about your next adventure. So thank you very much for being here.